Okay, so I've made a lot of videos on the topic of Loki's hammer at this point, but after doing some logic sorting, I'm starting to think that it's very likely that Loki's hammer possibly is a Dofra user, specifically a squirrel Dofra user, and that squirrel is based off of the death squirrel that originally appeared in concept art for One Piece film Strong World and is seen in various variations in the video game One Piece Odyssey. Now, how do I come to this conclusion? Well, after thinking about it, here's a very funny thing. So, we know that Ohara burned down. Then we know that the books of Ohara's library were fished out by the new giant warrior pirates, Haruden, Gerd, and Goldberg at the time, presumably. Vegapunk watched them do this and then later visited, I guess you could say, the new library of Ohara in ELBAPH as it was being curated by Jaguar D. Saul. So maybe when he was there, he taught the new giant warrior pirates the secret of putting devil fruits into items, because we know, I believe, at the tail end of Water 7, after Enies Lobby, we see Nami wiretapping a news report of some sort in which Vegapunk is credited with the discovery of putting devil fruits into objects, okay? So, with that being said, it would make a lot of sense as to why so many of the new giant warrior pirates have animal companions who are devil fruit users, because we know that Road has Iscat, who is supposedly a cat fruit model lion user. We know that Goldberg has a living shield who too could be a devil fruit user. I know in the past I've gone back and forth on whether it's a homie or a Delphi user, but I'm leaning more towards Delphi user because of the connections I'm making. And now we know too that Gerd has an owl named Piper. Piper could be some sort of item as well, perhaps a doctor's bag or some sort of doctor's tool, as Gerd is the doctor of the new giant warrior pirates. But continuing on with that, that leads me to believe that Loki's hammer probably is a Delphi user as well, given that so many members of the new giant warrior pirates seem to have animal buddies that end up being devil fruit users, or items who are devil fruit users. So we have Road with Iscat, who seems to have the cat fruit model lion. We have Goldberg's mysterious living shield, whom in the past I thought was a homie, but given the precedent set by Iscat, it's most likely a Zoan. And then we have Piper, Gerd's owl, who too might be a Delphi user. The only ones out so far are Harugan, the captain, and then the shipwright Stanson. So we'll have to wait and see if they have animal buddies as well. But so far, this seems to be a theme with them. With that being said, I do think, again, like I've said in the previous video, that Loki was once the co-captain of the new giant warrior pirates with his brother Haruden, because so far, when we're talking about the various variations of the giant warrior pirates, they've always been co-captain. A generation before Harrigan and the boys, we have Brocky and Dory, who were the co-captains of the giant warrior pirates. And before them, we have Jarl and Yorl, who were the old men in Big Mom's flashback, who are introduced as the former captains of the giant warrior pirates. So throughout the history of the giant warrior pirates existing, both old and new, they've always been co-captains. So that leads me to believe that Loki was a co-captain along with his brother once upon a time of the new giant warrior pirates. So with that being said, it's likely that his hammer is a devil fruit user, and I think that devil fruit is a squirrel devil fruit that's probably going to be a variation on the death squirrels based on how many strong world animals that are appearing in ELBAPH so far. So how does this trickle back down to Usopp? Well, I think after everything is said and done, Loki reclaiming his place as the captain, or rather co-captain, of the new giant warrior pirates will be infatuated or grateful to Usopp for saving his brother once upon a time and gift him his hammer. Said hammer will be a squirrel. Said squirrel, I think, will be a reference to the variations of the death squirrel that we see in One Piece Odyssey, the video game, because in that video game, you have various variations of this enemy with different abilities. Like there's an electric one and one that gives you kisses or something. It's really creepy looking. But I think the squirrel will react to whatever pop greens that it eats. So then the pop greens would give the squirrel different properties, and then in turn give the hammer different properties. How I think Usopp will be able to wield such a hammer is because I think in the Devil Fruit user being a giant hammer and the Devil Fruit in question being a squirrel, which may or may not be giant size, but that doesn't really matter because when it comes to items eating Zoan fruits, size and proportion seem to vary wildly, and they seem to be very transformative. So what might seem to be a giant squirrel at one point can shrink down to the size of a normal size squirrel, possibly, just given the fact that it seems as though when you have a item who's using the powers of a Zoan Devil Fruit, they seem to have all these sort of extra abilities just based on the relationship they have between their item form and the form they have as an animal. Given, for example, say Funkfried. Funkfried was an elephant who was actually a normal sword. But in his hybrid state, he was this long serpentine elephant-headed sword. He's been an elephant with a sword as a nose. There are just a bunch of different forms that Funkfried was able to take, which is kind of weird when you think about it. The same thing goes for someone like Smiley. Smiley was Gas, who ate the salamander fruit model axolotl. In being an axolotl and being a living creature, but also being like this big pile of ooze, it could be in multiple places at once, creating these sort of slime enemies. And said slime enemies had a degree of consciousness, so they could act, but they also retain the properties of the gas and they could explode given the flammable nature of the composition of the goop. So with that being said, what I mean is that rules do go out the window when we're talking about items who've eaten Devil Fruits. So going off of that, I think this will be great for Usopp because now we are giving him a power up in the form of this squirrel hammer, but then we're creating synergy between his ammunition, the pop greens, and the new hammer, which means the pop greens will now become still the central focal point of his entire set, because not only can they be used as ammunition, but once the squirrel eats a pop green, the squirrel, and then by extension the hammer, will gain an ability. Like, say, what if the squirrel ate the pop green that creates the impact wolf, right? So then the squirrel would then get properties of an impact dowel, presumably. So when it turns into a hammer, you're now getting the giant hit of the hammer plus the impact produced by an impact dowel, which then is a very sneaky reference all the way back to, say, Skypiea, or even more, I guess, immediately, the fight between Luffy and Usopp that happened. Usopp is always characterized through using dial technology. And this snuck its way back into the pop greens, which I think would come back around and sneak its way back into being a part of this new hammer set. So with that being said, I think there are a ton of possibilities that could occur from the squirrel gaining abilities from eating the pop greens. We may even find out that pop greens may originate from ELBAPH, because we don't know what kind of produce the Atom Treasure Tree produces. So that would even be cooler. But with that being said, what if to play on the idea of this hammer becoming a flying squirrel and playing off of the idea that the hammers that Usopp would fake with would always be balloons before presumably this point in which he gets a real giant hammer. What if the squirrel ate the pop green that produces the trampoline that Usopp used in combination with Zoro during Punk Hazard? Now the squirrel can become a balloon itself and help perhaps Usopp to fly if he hangs onto it. And now with the squirrel floating, either grabbing onto Usopp or Usopp standing on top of the squirrel, he can provide a vantage point for Usopp to now snipe enemies from the sky above, which I think would be a pretty cool thing if that were to be implemented. But it makes me think that there are so many possibilities, even like, say, the bomb grass pop green. What if that produces an ability in which it creates a terrible explosion on hit when Usopp uses a squirrel as a hammer? There are just so many different avenues and possibilities to go down if this ends up being the case. And I think it creates, again, some very interesting synergy between old and new and gives the pop greens even more purpose. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works It!